My name is Lisa. I wish I could say that my family and I were close. The kind of family that laughs loudly at dinners, shows up for every birthday, sends flowers when you're sick, and has group chats that never go silent. I wish I could say that we were bonded by unconditional love. But sometimes, families carry more silence than laughter, more obligation than affection, and sometimes, they slowly push you out without ever saying the words. It started subtly. The little signs were easy to ignore at first. A missed call that was never returned. A family photo shared online that I hadn't been invited to be a part of, excuses that didn't quite add up. My sister Sarah's engagement announcement came as a surprise to me. Not because she was getting married, but because I found out about it through a mutual friend's Instagram story. A cake, a ring, and everyone clapping except me. Watching it all from a glowing phone screen in my dimly lit apartment. I didn't even know she was engaged. That was the first knife. I remember thinking, maybe it was just an oversight. Maybe she meant to tell me and just got too caught up in the moment. We all get busy, right? I told myself that a dozen times. That the phone call would come. That the invitation was in the mail. That the silence was just temporary. Weeks went by. Then a month. Then two. My mother and I had exchanged a few brief texts, nothing warm. Nothing personal, just small, functional messages like, hope you're well. Did you change your number? Your aunt was asking about you. None of them mentioned the wedding. Not once, and still, I waited. Part of me was terrified to ask directly. I didn't want to hear what I feared might be true. So I waited, giving them space, hoping they'd realize I was still here, still family, still deserving of a seat at the table. But silence is loud when you know you're being left out. Family dinners were happening, bridesmaid meetings, dress fittings, cake tastings. I could see the traces on social media, in vague captions and blurry backgrounds, in the corners of smiling photos where I didn't belong. Every pixel reminded me that I had been erased from a story I thought I was part of. I began to feel like a ghost, not quite gone, but no longer present either. What hurt the most wasn't just the exclusion, it was the lack of honesty. No one came to me and said, Lisa, here's what we're feeling. Here's why things are different. They just quietly carried on with their celebrations, pretending like I didn't exist. It made me question everything. Was I really so easy to forget? So disposable? I started replaying every interaction, searching for clues. Did I say something wrong? Did I offend someone? Was it because I had distanced myself over the past few years, not out of spite, but for survival? Because being around them often meant shrinking myself, pretending to be someone I wasn't just to keep the peace. I left my hometown 4 years ago. I moved to a city where I could breathe, where I didn't have to explain my choices to anyone, where I didn't have to justify my beliefs, my relationships, my silence. I needed space, and maybe they took that personally. Maybe they saw my independence as betrayal. I never thought distance meant disownment, and yet, here I was, invisible in their joy, unwanted in their plans. I watched my sister's bachelorette party unfold through other people's posts. Sparkling dresses, laughter, champagne flutes clinking together. Girls I didn't even know were calling her sis in the captions. Meanwhile, her actual sister was scrolling in silence, holding her breath, trying not to cry in public. It felt like being dead to people who were still alive. At some point, the silence turned into anger. Not rage, but a deep aching kind of anger. The kind that sits behind your ribs and makes your chest feel tight. It wasn't just about the wedding anymore. It was about being unchosen by the people who were supposed to choose you without question. I wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding, that any day now, a message would arrive. Hey Lisa, of course you're invited, we've just been so caught up in everything. But that message never came. Instead, I saw my cousin post a story saying, can't wait for Sarah's big day, full family vibes, full family. Those words cut. I wasn't just being excluded from an event. I was being excluded from the definition of family itself. I started dreaming about them. Strange dreams, some beautiful, some cruel. In one, I was at the wedding, but no one would look at me. In another, I was giving a speech, only to realize halfway through that the room was empty. These dreams left me waking up with a lump in my throat and tears on my pillow. I told myself it didn't matter. That weddings are just events. That missing one day doesn't define your worth. But deep down, I knew it wasn't about the wedding, it was about belonging. About being seen. About being invited into moments that matter. I began to resent the notifications. Every new photo, every cheerful comment, every congratulatory post felt like salt in an open wound. I muted their stories. I stopped checking the family group chat that had gone quiet on me months ago. I stopped texting first, but the thing about family is, even when you stop reaching out, you're still holding on, just more quietly. I sat in my apartment one evening, staring at my calendar. The wedding date was circled, even though I wasn't going. I had written it down months ago, in some early burst of hope. That date now felt like a deadline, a countdown to something that wasn't mine. I kept thinking, what if I just showed up? What if I booked a flight, walked through those doors, and forced them to see me? Would they smile and pretend, or ask me to leave? The fact that I couldn't answer that question told me everything I needed to know, and yet, I still couldn't accept it. Not fully, not emotionally. Logically, I understood. They didn't want me there. Emotionally, I was still that little girl, clutching a drawing and hoping her parents would put it on the fridge. Hoping to be chosen, to be seen. It's strange how exclusion has a way of shrinking your identity. I started questioning who I was outside of them. If I wasn't the daughter who came home for holidays, if I wasn't the sister who gave a toast, if I wasn't the auntie who helped plan the baby shower that would eventually come, then what was I? I was Lisa. But what did that mean without them? I remembered birthdays where I had gone out of my way to make them feel special. I remembered defending them when others criticized. I remembered the times I swallowed my own pain just to avoid confrontation. And now, in their moment of joy, they couldn't even extend the basic kindness of a conversation. I would have understood, maybe not agreed, but understood. If they had said, "We're still hurt by what you said," or, "We don't feel close anymore." Even that would have been better than silence. Silence is the most cowardly cruelty. It's the kind that leaves you guessing, that never lets you heal, because you don't know what wound you're healing from, and yet. I still checked the mailbox every day. Even though I knew nothing was coming, I still opened every unknown number text with a flicker of hope. I still rehearsed my response, just in case someone finally asked, "Why haven't you RSVP'd yet?" I still imagined what I would have worn. I still remembered how, once upon a time, Sarah had said, "You'll be my maid of honor." Obviously, I still held on, even when they'd already let go. My name is Lisa, and by the time I realized I was no longer part of the celebration, the party had already moved on without me. My name is Lisa, and silence eventually becomes unbearable. There's a point where guessing is more painful than knowing. The ache of wondering whether you've been excluded intentionally or accidentally begins to consume every quiet moment. Every second that ticks by without a response feels like confirmation of your worst fears. It chips away at your self-respect, at your peace, at your ability to function without spiraling into thoughts that begin with "what if?" and end with "why not me?" So I reached out, not with anger, not with accusation, just a quiet question. A simple message, carefully worded, reread 20 times before sending, as if the right combination of words could unlock something. As if kindness could override whatever resentment had been building on their side. It said, "Hey, just wondering. A.M. I still invited to Sarah's wedding." That message sat in my phone like a loaded gun. It took hours before I got a reply. And when it came, it wasn't from Sarah. It was from my mother. Short, measured, without affection. Without hesitation. "We all agreed you're not welcome at the wedding." No explanation. No apology. No softness, just a wall of finality. My heart didn't break instantly. It just went quiet, like a room after the music stops. I read those words again and again, trying to extract meaning from them. Who was we? How many conversations had happened without me in the room? How long had this decision been made before they finally spoke it out loud? And why had no one had the courage to say it until now? That sentence didn't feel like a conversation. It felt like a verdict. A judgment already passed. My fate sealed by a council I never knew existed, a group of people I had once called family, now apparently unanimous in their disapproval. It's one thing to fall out with someone. That happens. People change, grow apart, hurt each other. But to be told everyone agreed. That's not just exclusion, that's collective exile. That's emotional execution with a group signature. I wanted to respond. I wanted to say something smart, something strong, something that would reclaim my dignity in the face of their coldness. But the truth was, I didn't feel strong. I felt stripped bare. Humiliated, infantilized, like a child being told she wasn't invited to her own birthday party. I stared at my phone, fingers hovering over the screen, typing and deleting message after message. I tried everything: sarcasm, outrage, pleading, silence. In the end, I said nothing. Because what can you say when someone tells you, directly, that you're not wanted? No open door. No half explanation. No "we wish it were different." Just a shut gate. That message marked a turning point. Not just in the story of the wedding, but in the story of my relationship with my family. It took the quiet pain of being left out and turned it into a loud rejection. It stopped being about miscommunication and became about intention. It wasn't that they forgot me, it was that they remembered and actively chose to leave me out. That decision didn't come from one person's impulse. It came from agreement, from discussion, from alignment. And maybe that's what hurt the most. Not that they excluded me, but that they talked about it and chose to exclude me together. They had turned me into a problem to be managed, a risk to be avoided, an unwanted presence. And they had done it without involving me. I wasn't given the chance to explain myself, to mend anything, to defend my side of the story. Whatever reasons they held, they kept them to themselves. They didn't want to understand, they just wanted me gone. And suddenly, every old memory began to sting with new meaning. The times I'd felt dismissed at dinners, the holidays where my voice barely mattered, the moments I'd tried to express my truth and was met with discomfort. The hints, the distance, the tension, it had all been leading to this. I thought back to the time I came out to them, to the silence on the other end of the call, to the way my mother said, "Well, that's your decision," like I had confessed to a crime, to the way Sarah avoided the subject for months, as if my identity was a stain she couldn't bleach from her picture-perfect life. They never said the words, "We're ashamed of you," but they didn't have to. They just let their discomfort speak louder. They let their distance grow wider. And eventually, they let their absence become complete. The wedding wasn't just a family event, it was a public celebration of everything they valued, everything they approved of, everything they wanted to showcase. And I, messy, honest, flawed, different, didn't fit the image. I was too loud in my truth, too distant from their expectations, too inconvenient to include, so they made a choice. And maybe they thought I'd understand. Maybe they thought I wouldn't care. Maybe they thought I'd gotten so used to being independent that I didn't need them. But the thing is, even the strongest people crave belonging. Even the most self-sufficient souls long to be rooted in something. We don't need approval, we need connection. We need to know we matter. And that's what they took away. Not just a wedding invite, but the sense that I mattered to them at all. After that message, everything changed. Not just in my relationship with them, but in how I saw myself. Because no matter how hard you try to stay grounded, rejection like that shakes you. It makes you question your worth. It makes you wonder, what did I do that made me unworthy of love, of family, of presence? I asked myself that question 1,000 times. Was I too distant? Too outspoken? Too independent? Too different? Or was I just too much of myself in a family that only loved a version of me that didn't exist anymore? They loved the quiet Lisa, the agreeable Lisa, the one who didn't challenge their beliefs or force them to think too deeply. The one who showed up, smiled, blended in. That Lisa was welcome, but she was gone. And the woman who replaced her whole, expressive, healed, healing, was a threat to the fragile illusion they lived in. So they voted, not formally, but emotionally. They circled around each other and said things like, "It's better this way. We don't want drama. Let's keep it peaceful." But what they really meant was, let's keep it clean. Let's keep it curated. Let's keep her out. It's strange how families can convince themselves that exclusion is kindness, that removing someone is protecting everyone else, that silence is safer than truth, but there's nothing kind about erasing someone. There's nothing protective about pretending they don't exist. There's nothing peaceful about silence when it's used as a weapon. After the confrontation, I didn't cry the way I expected. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just sat with the truth. Let it sink into my bones like cold rain. Let it wash away the illusion that I was still part of something. Let it empty me of the hope I had clung to. It was almost peaceful. That hollowing out like standing in the middle of a burned-down house and realizing the fire's over. There's nothing left to save. Only ashes to walk through. The confrontation wasn't a fight. It wasn't a heated argument. It was the quiet sound of a door locking from the other side. And sometimes, that's worse than yelling, because at least, when people fight, they're trying. At least when people scream, they still care. But when they lock you out and walk away, that's when you know. That's when you finally understand that it wasn't about what you did, it was about who you are, and that, in their eyes, was reason enough. My name is Lisa, and I finally heard the words they'd been avoiding for years. Not with volume, not with cruelty, but with a quiet message that said everything they'd never had the courage to say out loud. You don't belong here anymore. My name is Lisa, and after rejection comes reflection. There's something about being excluded that doesn't let you rest. Even when the words are clear, the silence afterward becomes louder than anything. It demands answers, reasons, patterns, and so, the mind becomes a courtroom. Evidence is examined. Memories are replayed. Moments that once seemed ordinary are now cross-examined for hidden meaning. I couldn't let it go, not because I didn't understand the message, but because I didn't understand the motive. What had I done that made them all agree I shouldn't be at the wedding? What invisible rule had I broken? What version of me had they quietly grown to resent? And slowly, painfully, the truth began to unravel, not from their words, but from mine. Not from what they said, but from what I had always known, deep down, and refused to face. The rejection didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't a sudden decision. It was a result, a buildup, a slow accumulation of grudges, disappointments, and judgments they had never spoken aloud, but never stopped holding on to. The first cracks had appeared years ago. So subtly I didn't recognize them as fractures. They looked like disagreement, disappointment, distance. But really, they were the beginning of the divide. They had never fully accepted my choices. Not in the loud, dramatic way some families react, but in the quiet, lingering way that seeps into every interaction. A disapproving glance, a passive-aggressive comment, a family joke with a pointed edge. They called it teasing. They called it love. They said, "You know how we are." But I knew better. I felt the weight behind every word. Every time they joked about how Lisa's always been the different one, or you know her, always doing things her own way, they weren't celebrating me, they were othering me, reminding me that I wasn't quite one of them. It started with small things, the way I dressed, the way I spoke up, the way I didn't follow the unspoken script that governed our family roles. I didn't play my part the way they wanted. I didn't sit quietly. I didn't hide the things they found uncomfortable. I wasn't ashamed of the parts of me they had been taught to suppress, and that was a problem. They didn't know how to handle difference without trying to control it. They didn't know how to love me without trying to edit me, so instead of adjusting their love, they adjusted their expectations, lowered them, bit by bit, until eventually they expected nothing. Until the absence of connection didn't feel strange anymore, it just became the new normal, and then came the bigger things. The parts of me I couldn't and wouldn't hide. The truth about who I loved. The truths about what I believed in. The boundaries I had set. The fact that I had stopped living for their approval and started living for my peace. They saw that as rebellion. I saw it as survival. I had once tried to explain it to them, not to justify myself, but to let them in. I wanted them to understand me. But I learned quickly that they didn't want understanding. They wanted compliance. They wanted the version of me who didn't challenge their worldview, who didn't make them question their comfort. And when I stopped trying to perform that version, their disappointment turned into resentment. They never said it out loud, but it lived in their tone. It lived in the way they spoke about me when they thought I wasn't listening. It lived in the way they left me out of things, slowly, casually, as if it didn't matter. But it did matter. It always mattered. I wasn't estranged from them because I hated them. I distanced myself because staying close meant erasing myself. Because every time I tried to come home, I felt less seen, less safe, less like I belonged. Not because they were openly cruel, but because they were passively indifferent. And that kind of indifference, the kind dressed in politeness and silence, is even more painful than rage. They didn't yell, they didn't argue, they didn't slam doors. They just stopped including me, and I had convinced myself, for years, that it was unintentional. That they still loved me, just didn't know how to express it. That if I kept showing up, kept forgiving, kept softening myself, one day they would meet me halfway, but they never did. Because for them, love had always been conditional. Unspoken, but conditional. Love as long as you behave. Love as long as you agree. Love as long as you don't make us uncomfortable. And I had broken all those conditions. I had made choices they didn't agree with. I had drawn boundaries they didn't respect. I had become a person they didn't understand. And instead of getting curious, they got cold. And in that coldness, they nursed their grudges. Silently, collectively. Family resentment doesn't always explode. Sometimes, it just festers, unaddressed, unspoken, wrapped in smiles and traditions, hidden behind birthday cards and half-hearted hugs. But it grows. It grows into decisions like she won't be at the wedding, because it's easier to exclude someone than it is to face the discomfort they bring. It's easier to blame them for the distance than to ask yourself why you feel so far away. They never asked. They just assumed. Assumed I didn't care. Assumed I thought I was better. Assumed my silence was arrogance, not protection. And I stopped explaining. Because I realized I wasn't being misunderstood. I was being judged, quietly, constantly. They talked about me when I wasn't there. I knew it. You can always feel when someone is discussing you behind closed doors. It changes the energy when you walk into the room. It changes the way they greet you. It changes what they don't say, and I could feel it every time. The cousins, who stopped reaching out. The siblings who only messaged when they needed something. The parents who gave updates about my life like I was a distant relative, not their daughter. And yet, I still showed up. Still tried. Still hoped. Because we're taught to believe that family always finds its way back to each other. That blood is thicker than hurt. That time heals everything. But time doesn't heal what no one is willing to talk about. Time just builds a wall of avoidance. And eventually, you find yourself standing on one side of it, wondering how you became the outsider. I became the one they could all agree on excluding. Because I was the one who had changed. The one who stopped apologizing for who she was. The one who refused to keep pretending. And when you stop pretending, you lose people who only loved the mask. The grudge wasn't about one moment. It was about the accumulation of every time I didn't conform. Every time I said no. Every time I stood in my truth instead of bending to theirs. They saw my authenticity as defiance, my independence as rejection, and instead of trying to know me, they wrote a version of me that fit their narrative and then punished me for it. They called me distant, but never looked at the reasons I pulled away. They called me selfish, but never acknowledged the sacrifices I made to keep the peace. They called me dramatic, but never sat through the silence that came after being constantly invalidated. They held their grudges, like heirlooms passed down, polished, protected. They didn't ask me why I left. They just resented that I didn't stay. And all of that, resentment, that quiet weight they had been carrying for years, culminated in one final decision. One message. One sentence that carried every unsaid word. We all agreed, you're not welcome at the wedding. It was never about just one event. It was about everything that came before it. The grudges were always there. The wedding was just the excuse. My name is Lisa, and the most painful part of being shut out wasn't the rejection. It was realizing they had been building the door to shut me out for years, brick by brick, word by word, silence by silence. And I had been standing on the wrong side of it the whole time. My name is Lisa. And after the rejection, there was nothing left to imagine. Only the aftermath. Once the words had been said, once the invitation had been confirmed as withheld, once the silence had broken with that one cold message, the emotional collapse was inevitable. Not sudden, not explosive. Just slow, spreading, and inescapable. Like a bruise blooming under the skin long after the blow. The fallout didn't look like rage. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It didn't beg for attention or justice. It was quiet and invisible. It lived inside my chest and wrapped itself around my thoughts like fog. Everything began to feel heavier. Getting out of bed took longer. Responding to messages felt pointless. Eating became mechanical. Days blurred. And every few minutes, like an involuntary tick, the memory of the message replayed itself. We all agreed, you're not welcome. No matter what I was doing, that sentence found its way back into my head. And every time, it struck with the same coldness as the first time. Grief took hold of me in pieces, never all at once. I would be fine for hours, and then a memory would hit me from the side, something I had forgotten I was holding on to. Like the time my mother and I baked cookies together, laughing at nothing in particular. Or the way Sarah used to hold my hand when we crossed the street as kids. Or how we used to make up songs in the back seat during long car rides, as if we were invincible. And now those memories felt like someone else's life. A life that had been taken from me before I even realized it was fading. I felt like I was mourning people who were still alive. And maybe that's the worst kind of grief, the kind that doesn't come from death, but from deliberate distance. When someone dies, you're allowed to cry. You're allowed to fall apart. You're surrounded by sympathy, understanding, community. But when you're rejected by the living, especially by your family, the world doesn't pause for you. People don't know what to say. And so, most say nothing. Which makes the pain feel even more isolating. There was no funeral for the version of my family that I had lost, but I was grieving all the same. I was grieving the future that would no longer include me. The events I wouldn't be invited to. The birthdays I would hear about only after they'd happened. The photos I would see online, knowing I wasn't, missed the new bonds being built without me, and worse, the narrative being written in my absence, because when people push you out, they rarely take accountability for doing so. Instead, they rewrite history. They start telling a version of events where you drifted, where you changed, where you stopped caring. And because you're not there to defend yourself, your silence becomes consent to the story they've chosen. The emotional fallout wasn't just sadness, it was fury. Not at them, necessarily, but at the injustice of it all. The way they got to be the ones celebrating, smiling, moving forward while I was stuck in the wreckage, cleaning up a mess I didn't make alone. I wanted to scream, "Do you even care what you've done?" But I knew the answer. If they cared, I wouldn't be here. If they cared, they would have called. If they cared, they would have questioned the decision before making it. But they didn't. They chose what was easiest for them, and I was left with everything that choice left behind. It changed how I saw myself, not just in relation to them, but entirely. If the people who watched me grow, who knew my history, who celebrated my childhood, who shaped the early parts of who I am, could now turn away, what did that mean about me? Was I truly as difficult as they believed? As selfish, as dramatic? I started to believe their version of me, not all at once, but in pieces. Doubt crept in like water through cracks. It soaked into my thoughts. Maybe I'm too much. Maybe I should have just stayed quiet. Maybe I should have let things go instead of pushing back. Maybe I should have kept showing up, even when I wasn't okay. And then came the guilt. Guilt for not being the daughter they wanted. Guilt for not fitting in. Guilt for choosing boundaries over tradition. Guilt for not knowing how to fix something. I didn't break on my own. But guilt doesn't heal wounds, it only deepens them. There were moments when I thought about reaching out again, thought about writing a long message explaining my side, thought about apologizing, not because I believed I was wrong, but because I wanted to be back in their good graces. I wanted peace more than I wanted pride. But then I stopped myself. Because I realized that apology wouldn't be about reconciliation, it would be about erasure. I would be erasing everything I had fought so hard to build within myself. Just to be let back into a space that clearly didn't have room for the real me. And that's when the next layer of fallout hit. The reality that healing would have to happen alone. I wouldn't get closure from them. I wouldn't get an apology. I wouldn't get a thoughtful conversation or a tearful reunion. What I would get is silence. Maybe forever, so I began the painful process of finding comfort in that silence. Not because it was comforting, but because it was mine. At least, I could control it. At least I knew what to expect from it. Silence, though cold, is consistent. I started therapy again. Not because I thought I was broken, but because I needed help holding everything I was carrying. And in those sessions, I said the things I hadn't said to anyone else. I said I felt abandoned. I said I felt betrayed. I said I wasn't sure I even knew what love looked like anymore, because the people who said they loved me had shut the door on me without explanation. I said I was angry. I said I was scared. I said I felt like I had been exiled for becoming the kind of person who could survive without them. And maybe that threatened them more than anything else. I also said I missed them, even now, even after everything, because love doesn't just vanish. It doesn't dissolve the moment someone hurts you. Love lingers. That's what makes grief so cruel. It shares a bed with affection. You mourn and miss and love all at once. And none of those emotions cancel the others out. That contradiction is exhausting. Carrying love for people who no longer see you. Carrying hope that gets smaller every day, but refuses to fully die. Carrying the urge to prove yourself, even when you know it's no longer your responsibility. The emotional fallout meant redefining everything. What family meant. What home meant. What worth meant. I had to strip all of it down and start from the beginning, because if I didn't, I would always live at the mercy of their validation. Always wait for the next invitation. Always measure my value by whether or not they had space for me in their lives. I didn't want to live like that anymore. Not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. I started writing letters I would never send. Letters to my mother. Letters to my sister. Letters to my past self. I poured out every feeling I had swallowed. I told them what their silence did to me. I told them how much I had longed for them to fight for me. I told them I understood, even though it hurt, and that I wasn't waiting anymore. Some nights I burned those letters. Other nights I kept them. Each one was a release, a letting go, even if only for a moment. And slowly, painfully, I began to find pieces of myself that didn't belong to them. Parts of me that had never needed their approval. Parts that had been buried under years of trying to please, trying to fit, trying to survive. Those parts were angry, yes, but they were also powerful, honest, whole, and they reminded me that belonging doesn't always come from the places you expect. Sometimes it has to be built from the ground up, in spaces where your truth is welcomed, not tolerated. Sometimes, family isn't blood. Sometimes, it's found in those who choose you, over and over, without condition. The emotional fallout left wreckage, but it also cleared space. Space to ask better questions. Space to unlearn the stories I had been told about myself. Space to grieve not only the family I lost, but the version of me that had needed them so desperately. There are still days when it hurts. Still moments when I ache for a different ending. Still dreams where they reach out and say, "We were wrong." And sometimes I wake up crying. But then I breathe. I sit in the quiet, and I remind myself, I survived it. Not because it didn't matter, but because I do. My name is Lisa, and in the fallout, I lost a family I thought I needed, but I found a self I had nearly abandoned. And maybe, just maybe, that's the beginning of something new.